Hello folks, so today we have a strut replacement job to do on our Lexus. 2005 RX330 Lexus. I've ordered the struts, pulled it into the garage here, and Rocky has to inspect it and check it in. Make sure there's no contraband, which he does. And he learns that it's all clean, good to go. Benign. He comes back and says, yep, good, Dad. So I'm going to start removing the right rear wheel so that I can get in there and remove the first strut. This strut is spring-loaded, so it's all one unit. However, when you buy from Lexus, you only get what's considered a shock or the strut without the spring. And you'll see that pretty soon. We have to remove the spring out of the strut and change it over to the new strut. At any rate, first I take a look at the tire, and the tire definitely is worn irregular. So it has some kind of an issue. I don't know if it's the back or the front or both. This car does have over 200,000 miles on it. The struts have never been changed that I know of. Pretty sure they have not been, because we've owned the car since it was about 3,500 miles new. So I check out the other linkages on the rear, on the right rear, after removing the tire to see if there's anything else loose. I don't find anything. So next, I go about removing the strut. So there are 3 bolts up inside the trunk that have to come out, and a couple of bolts down below. One thing I noticed right off the bat, that the boot or sleeve that covers the seal around the cylinder is defective. It's been torn and allowing dirt and grit to get over around the seal, around that cylinder. That's never good. Don't see any excessive oil on this strut. That's what usually happens. They start leaking oil. But for now, we need to remove several bolts. It's going to take a 10 millimeter, a 14 millimeter, a 17 millimeter, 19 millimeter sockets to remove all of the bolts. That happens to be a 12. There's a 10 millimeter that comes out that removes the brake line and the ABS sensor line. So those 2 come off first. And there's 2 large 19 millimeter nuts that have to come off. That's the 2 main bolts that bolt the strut to the wheel assembly. So with an impact and a few wrenches, off it comes. So that's all the bolts that need to come loose down below. Now we need to move up top and remove the 3 bolts that are at the top up in the fender well area inside the trunk. There's a decorative cover that comes off and gives you access to these 3 bolts. Remove those. Those are 14 millimeter nuts actually. Then the strut comes out. There it is. There's a full assembly. So as I said, we need to remove the springs off of this strut, so we take it over to the junkyard tailgate. I did rent a spring removal kit. It's basically a spring compression kit. Compress the springs so that you can remove all of the other gaskets and hardware, remove the spring, and then place it back on the new strut. So you get this from O'Reilly's or AutoZone. In this case, O'Reilly's. $56. You essentially buy the tool or rent it, but it's the same cost as if you bought it, and if you return it, you get your money back. So it's essentially a rental. If you choose to keep it, you certainly can, and you just don't get your money back. So it's a fairly basic tool. It has a couple of pieces of all thread basically, and a couple of cast iron pieces that will attach onto the spring. These can be potentially dangerous because they're under a tremendous amount of pressure. So be careful. Take a look at the tool, make sure it's in good condition. In this case, it's brand new. So I got lucky there. What came off of the shelf was a brand new tool, and I'm the first one using it. So let's place the first tool on the first side of this first spring and get it snugged up there, and then put an impact wrench to it and take it down a little bit before we put on the second side. Now with that first side snugged up a little, let's put on the second side tool and insert the safety pins, and we'll impact it down. One thing I learned on the back struts is it doesn't take much compression to get them released. On the front, it's quite a different story. On the front, you have to compress them almost as far as they'll be compressed. So the next step is to remove this cylinder nut off of the strut cylinder that actually protrudes up into the fender well on the back strut in this case. So I remove that, and there's also a bushing in there that I need to dump out of there. So I pick up that strut and dump the bushing out. So save the bushing, save the nut. The new strut does come with a new nut. I would recommend you using the new nut because this is torqued to a specification. So now we're ready to remove the rubber boot there and the spring off of the old strut. Next, there is a rubber bumper bushing that slides off of that shaft. You'll keep that and you'll put that on the new strut. So it just essentially slides off of the strut shaft there and strut rod, and you reuse that piece. So hang on to that. So out of curiosity, I wanted to see how strong these strut cylinders were, and I had no idea what to expect, but it was fairly easy on this one to push down, and I actually had to pull it back up, which I found interesting. But anyway, we'll compare that against the new one. So I put the new one up in the same position and pressed down on the new strut. Took a lot more strength to do so, which was a good thing. And as you notice, the strut pushed back up under its own power without me pulling it up. So that was what I experienced on the back struts. You'll find on the front struts, which makes it problematic, the strut actually retracts under its own pressure, which is why you have to compress the spring a lot more just to get the nut on the strut rod. Okay, now let's reinstall this bumper bushing onto the rod. Next, let's remove the old boot from the spring and install the new one. And finally, let's pick up this spring assembly with the new boot in it and slide it over the strut rod assembly and put it in place so that we can now screw the rod nut back on that holds this thing all together. It's sort of like working with a wet noodle here for a little bit because it's all loose until you finally get that one nut on it that will actually recompress this spring again. So with a little coordination, I positioned the spring over the shaft, installed the little bushing that we removed earlier, and screwed on the nut and hit it with an impact. Now we have the new strut equipped with the old spring and ready to install. We just position it back where it were and tighten down the 14mm nuts that hold it up top inside of the fender well. Put the two 19mm bolts in down below, and the other 14 and 10mm bolts as well. Okay, so there you go. I recorded one, do this times 4, and you'll be finished. So from there, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, or dissent. You've been watching the Junkyard Tailgate channel. Good day.
what you been doing? Rocky. Yep, that's where I found it all. Yep. Were you supposed to have the glove? No. 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 How about the garden hose sprinkler? No. Oh, you want some love now? I bet you do. Is you a good boy? Is you a good boy? Aw, you're a good boy, aren't you? You just can't help it. Yes. We just can't help it. Who's a funny boy?